Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
I am going to start with the moment that still makes my jaw clench, because it was so stupidly clear, and yet somehow I still hoped they would surprise me. The moment my mother looked at her phone while I was explaining that the specialist recommended a treatment plan that wasn't cheap but could finally get my symptoms under control, and she breathed out this tired little laugh and said I was leaning into drama again, that I needed to stop Googling and start living, and then, not even 2 hours later, my brother texted the family chat about his big idea, and my parents replied with fireworks and heart reactions and a promise to sit down that weekend to discuss how to back him. Which is how I learned that the family fund that apparently did not exist when I asked for help suddenly existed when Ethan wanted a runway for his app. I wish I could tell you I yelled or made a speech or threw something heavy, because it would be satisfying in the movie version, but the truth is I did what I usually did, which was to go very quiet and lay out the facts like I was building a careful line of dominoes, because years of being told to calm down teaches you that nothing scares people who dismiss you more than calm. And I said that the treatment plan was not some vanity cleanse, but a structured regimen from an actual human doctor with a medical license, that the tests were not cheap and my insurance covered only part of it, and that I was not asking for charity so much as asking for parents who believed their daughter when she said she could not keep pretending everything was fine. And my mother's response, delivered with the same tone she used when I brought home laundry from college, was that I had always been sensitive and that I should consider yoga. Here is the part one hate admitting because it sounds so small, but it mattered to me in a way that felt like someone pressing a bruise on purpose. My father did not say anything, not a word. He just counted out the reasons why the market was brutal right now and why it made more sense to put money behind something that might scale instead of behind what he called open-ended medical costs. And he used phrases like return on investment and opportunity cost, and I sat there realizing I was being compared to a product line that could be discontinued if the margins were bad, and yes, I know how cold that sounds, but that is exactly how it felt. If you have ever been told that your pain is a performance, you will understand the next part, which is that I almost apologized, and I almost said never mind, and I almost promised to figure it out alone so they would not be bothered. Instead, I asked a simple question that has lived rent-free in my head ever since, which was whether the mysterious education fund that had been described for years as tapped out and locked up and gone was the same account being used to bankroll my brother's launch, and my mother frowned like I was being crass while my father said the account was complicated and he could not get into the details, but yes, there were resources available. And he reminded me that Ethan was taking a risk that could benefit the whole family if it worked, which is when something in me snapped in a very quiet way. I started saving things, because when people decide your reality is optional you learn to keep receipts, so I screenshotted the text where my mother wrote that my health updates made her feel drained, and I saved the voicemail where my father asked me to reframe my symptoms as challenges, and I kept the email from the specialist that laid out the plan in clear steps with expected outcomes and timelines, and I filed away the Bank of Dad pep talk he sent to Ethan about entrepreneurial grit. And no, I did not know exactly what I would do with any of it, but I had the sense, like a low hum in the back of my skull, that I would need it. When the investment meeting happened, I did not go, because I was not invited, and I learned the amount from my brother, who told me without shame that our parents had committed $80,000 to get him through the first phase. And if you are wondering whether I asked again for help after that number hit the air, I did not, because nothing screams your place in the family like a price tag, and hearing that figure settled the argument I had been having with myself for years about whether I was overreacting, and I realized I had been waiting for a moment that would make me stop bargaining for scraps of empathy and start behaving like my own guardian. People always want to know what the condition is, and I get that curiosity, but it is not the headline. The headline is that I was not believed, that every time I mentioned a flare or a setback, I was met with advice that sounded caring but translated to stop inconveniencing us, and by the time the startup money landed, I had learned to do logistics in my sleep. So I sat down with a notebook and made a plan that did not include another round of begging, because if you have to plead for Compassion. You already have your answer, and I decided that instead of trying to convince them, I would let them experience what it felt like to be on the outside of the story they thought they controlled. The first part of that plan was simple and boring and incredibly effective. I stopped volunteering information, I stopped asking for check-ins, I stopped offering updates. I stopped letting them frame me as needy by removing the opportunities to perform that role, and I shifted every conversation to email or text because calls vanish and messages linger, and I became very busy in ways they could not measure or dismiss, building a work schedule that accommodated my good days and my bad ones, turning to friends who understood without performance notes, and telling the few people who asked that I was fine, which in this case meant stable enough to be dangerous. I would love to tell you that I felt pure and noble and wise, but honestly, I felt petty and tired and a little feral, and yet there was a clean line inside me that had never been there before, a sense that I was walking towards something that would finally put the weight down. And when I saw the first public post about my brother's launch party, with my parents clapping in the front row like they had minted a new currency, I did not cry, I did not rage, I just opened my files and labeled a new folder with a name that made me smile, and I started drawing connections that were not about hurt feelings but about patterns, about how people behave when they believe there will be no consequences. If you are waiting for the dramatic confrontation, you are going to be disappointed, because the next time my mother called to check in, I talked about the weather, and the errands I needed to run, and the recipe she had sent me months earlier. And before she could pivot to Ethan's big week, I said I was heading into an appointment, because I was, and she tried to remind me to keep perspective, and I said I had all the perspective I needed, and I meant it, and when I hung up I realized I felt something close to relief, like I had finally stopped auditioning for the part of good daughter in a show that never wanted me. They did not know it yet, but that was the last time they were going to speak to the version of me who played along, because I had already decided what the first real move would be, and it would be quiet, and it would be permanent. And it would make them look at themselves in a way no argument ever had, and I knew exactly where I was going to start. I just had to wait for the right audience. When people say follow the money, they usually mean some grand corruption trail with shell companies and shady checks, but in my world it meant looking straight at the bright, cheerful way my parents explained that the education fund, which had been a ghost for years, suddenly had flesh and breath when my brother needed a runway, and deciding I would stop arguing about fairness and start building a written record so clean that no one with a conscience could read it without feeling a tightness in the throat. And the first step was a single email that did not accuse or cry or demand, an email that thanked them for taking the time to talk, summarized what each of us had said, noted that my specialist had recommended a structured plan that required a set of treatments over a specific number of months, with predictable costs, and acknowledged their decision to invest family resources into Ethan's startup while declining to assist with my medical plan, and then asked, with the politest tone I could muster, that they reply to confirm I had captured everything correctly so I could plan accordingly. You would think a message like that might provoke a call or a defensive wall of words, but the reply arrived the same evening like a receipt from an online store, short and neat from my father's account saying yes, that was accurate, they loved me, they believed I was strong, and they were confident that focusing on Ethan's launch would provide a path for the whole family later. And my mother added a line about mindset and self-healing that made me want to laugh and scream at the same time, and when I read it again in the morning, the shock had turned into something calmer and colder, because now it was not a debate or a memory or a story subject to someone else's version. It was signed and time-stamped and mine. I will tell you what I did next, because it is the kind of petty that is also practical, and because it was the first small revenge that actually changed the terrain, not with fire but with paperwork, which is harder to ignore. I updated my healthcare proxy and advanced directives so that the person who would speak for me in an emergency was not either of my parents, but my friend Lena, who had sat with me through appointments without making me feel like a burden. And I had the forms notarized and copied, then mailed one set to my parents with a short note that said I was streamlining responsibilities so they would not be put in uncomfortable positions, and that if hospital staff ever called they should direct them to Lena first. And while I kept the tone soft and reasonable, we both know what I was saying, which was you lost the right to make decisions for me when you decided my pain was a hobby, and you will not get to perform compassion in a waiting room when compassion was not available in your living room. You might ask whether that step mattered to them, whether it even registered, and I can tell you it did, because my mother replied with a paragraph about feeling pushed out and my father asked if this was necessary and whether we could revisit after the launch. Which told me they liked the optics of being the point people in a crisis, liked the power and the narrative of the caring parents who shoulder hard calls, and stripping that away without yelling or slamming a door was, in its own way, a scalpel rather than a hammer, and I felt it slide into place with a precision that made me sleep better for the first time in months. Meanwhile, the startup parade kept marching, because there were photos to take and posts to share and language to polish about disruption and scale, and although I did not attend the pitch dinner, I heard plenty about it. About the way my father introduced Ethan to two friends from his Rotary circle, about the way my mother found a way to say proud in every sentence, as if repetition could make the investment feel wise. And I noticed how many times they called me to tell me that the energy was electric and that this was a family moment even if I did not understand it yet, and each time I kept my voice steady and said I wished them a good evening, and then wrote down every phrase that softened their decision into something noble, because one day the contrast would matter. Pulling back sounds passive, but it was a very active choice, and it meant muting the family chat where updates about the app rolled in with the speed and shine of a new toy. And it meant switching to email for anything that smelled like potential conflict so nothing evaporated. And it meant letting calls go to voicemail when I was too raw to be polite, so I would not hand them the chance to label me hysterical. And it also meant investing in myself with a seriousness they had never extended to me, which in my case looked like saying yes to a remote contract that fit around my health and could become something bigger if I delivered, and then over-delivering with a stubbornness that came from anger and also from relief. Because working with people who cared about output rather than my ability to play cheerful daughter was like stepping into air that did not hurt to breathe. Ethan, to his credit or perhaps his blindness, called me like nothing had changed, generous and excited in a way that could almost trick me into feeling included. And he asked me to look over the deck because he remembered I was good at telling a story without fluff, and in another life I might have said yes and saved him from the worst of it. But in this life, I asked whether he was open to feedback that might not be what he wanted to hear, and when he said he was all ears, I told him honestly that the product did not solve a real problem yet, and that his user research was 3 friends and a cousin, and he laughed and said I was always the straight shooter, which I took as a compliment and also as a sign that he did not understand what was coming. If you are keeping score of small revenges, here is another that looked like nothing from the outside, but felt like rearranging the spine of the story. I created a private folder labeled with a name only I knew, and inside it I organized every message about the startup and every message about my health into 2 neat stacks, and I began tagging them by theme: support versus dismissal, risk versus return, loyalty versus optics, and doing this taught me something crucial, which was that my parents were not villains out of a fairy tale. They were ordinary people who had absorbed a simple, ugly lesson from the world, that a son with a pitch is an asset and a daughter with a diagnosis is a debt. And knowing that gave me the freedom to stop begging for a new script and start planning for the audience I cared about. The audience was not the internet, and it was not a courtroom, and it was not a therapist's office. It was the exact group of people who had watched my parents play patron and judge for years and nodded along. The friends and cousins and neighbors who only ever saw the highlight reel, and I realized that if I was patient I could let my parents tell on themselves without me naming them, because people inevitably expose their values when there is applause nearby. So when I got invited to a Women in Tech panel through my new contract and learned that it would be hosted at the very community center where my mother ran her committees and my father played host to visiting speakers, I said yes before the sentence was finished, and I knew exactly how I would handle the Q&A, not by dragging anyone, but by stating, with the kind of calm the old me tried to fake, what happens when family chooses investment over care. Before any of that, though, I wanted one more confirmation that my parents were exactly where they wanted to be, so I sent a second email as polite as a dinner invitation. asking if they would prefer I stop bringing up health updates altogether since they found them draining, and I said I would respect whatever boundary made them comfortable. And my mother wrote back that she thought that would be best for now so the family could focus on positive things, and my father added a line about staying the course with Ethan until the first milestones were hit, and reading those words I felt the strangest combination of sadness and freedom, because I could finally do what I had wanted to do since that first ridiculous conversation, which was take them at their word and let the silence do the talking. I did not slam any doors or post any rants. I simply stepped back and put the machinery in motion, and on the morning I received the glossy invitation to Ethan's launch event with my parents listed as hosts and benefactors. I forwarded it to Lena with a single sentence about calendar conflicts and then opened my laptop to finalize the talk I had been invited to give, a talk that would not mention names or titles or even relationships, just choices and consequences. And as I saved the file, I understood that the next time my parents saw me speak, it would not be at their table and it would not be on their terms, and the first row would not be reserved for them, though they would be sitting there anyway, not because I asked them, but because it is exactly where they wanted to be. There is a kind of leaving that does not look like leaving from the outside, because there are no slammed doors or blocked numbers or dramatic announcements. There are only small decisions repeated until they become the bones of a new life. So I started with the boring ones that people underestimate, the ones that make you less available for performance and more available for reality. And I told my landlord I was renewing without the cosigner my parents always insisted on including as a show of support that doubled as a leash. I called the bank and removed them from the emergency contact list they used as a way to peek at balances under the guise of safety. I changed the answer to my account recovery questions because my mother liked to treat herself to the role of secretary when what she wanted was control, and then I turned toward work like it was a raft in rough water, and I built, very quietly, a week that matched my body instead of punishing it, a calendar with padded edges and clear lanes and the kind of focus that comes when you finally stop trying to pass tests designed by people who do not believe you deserve a score. Independence is not glamorous. It is invoices and passwords and taking your car in on a day when you would rather curl up on the floor. It is choosing a contractor who sends emails over one who insists on calls because you need written records for everything now. It is saying no to the soft trap of gifts with strings, the kitchen upgrade my mother wanted to buy so she could remind me that she invests in my home too, the extra cushion my father offered toward an insurance premium so he could call it partnership later, and it is the steady, quiet pleasure of paying for what you can and doing without what you cannot, because the minute you stop negotiating with people who hold affection like a coupon you might be lucky enough to redeem, the noise goes down and you can finally hear yourself think, and in that quiet I started reaching out to people they respected for reasons that had nothing to do with me being their daughter. I did not target anyone, I simply did the work in a way that made the work visible to the right eyes. And that meant replying quickly when a client introduced me to a project manager who also happened to run the programming committee at the community center where my mother curated her little empire of sign-up sheets and seating charts. It meant saying yes to a pro bono consult for a local business group because my father loved to be the person who connected speakers to audiences, and I knew exactly how those emails were worded and who received them, and it meant doing a good job in a way that was hard to dismiss. Clear results, clean language, none of the drama label they had glued to my name for years. And then stepping back without asking for a spotlight, which is exactly when spotlights start to swing your way. The startup noises kept coming like the clatter from a kitchen where nothing is actually cooking, a lot of motion and heat and bragging about spice. But when I looked closely at the updates Ethan posted, I could see the gaps. The way he was measuring progress in meetings rather than in users. The way he emphasized praise from people who had no reason to be honest with him, and I said nothing because that was not my job, not anymore, and because I had learned the hardest lesson of all, which is that when people choose to be blind, you cannot pry their eyelids open without becoming the villain of their story. So I put my energy into resilience instead of rescue, into making sure that whether the next month brought a flare or a calm stretch, I could keep my promises to myself. If you want the moment the ground shifted under them, it was an email that began as a courtesy and landed like a brick, and I sent it without heat, just policy and plain language. To the director of the community center and the head of the volunteer council, copying my parents and my friend Lena, and I said that while I appreciated the community's interest in family health stories during their fundraising season, I did not consent to my medical situation being discussed, summarized, or referenced in speeches, newsletters, or donor appeals, and that any future mention of my name, story, or health would require written permission from me. And I attached a short letter from a lawyer who owed me a favor that quoted basic privacy principles and community guidelines, and I ended with a courteous thank you for respecting boundaries and a line that sounded like courtesy but functioned as a reminder that my parents' roles as volunteers did not grant them authority to represent my experiences. You would have thought I had set off a fire alarm with a whisper, because the replies arrived in waves, the director thanking me for clarifying and promising to remind speakers and committee leads of consent policies, a board member chiming in to say that this aligned nicely with the center's values, my mother asking in a private thread why I was trying to embarrass her when all she had ever done was share a little context to inspire people, my father suggesting we resolve this offline as if I had committed some breach by refusing to let them wrap my pain in a bow for their public image, and I said, very calmly, that the whole point of written policies is that they apply everywhere, online, offline, at podiums and potlucks, and that I was done being a character in any story I did not author, and that was the second revenge, a paper wall they could not knock down without admitting out loud what they thought they were entitled to use. Around that time, the invitations for Ethan's big launch started to sound less like victory laps and more like pep rallies for a team that had not scored yet. And when my cousin forwarded me a message from my father asking a handful of relatives to attend as a show of support because early momentum is everything, I understood that the money had not turned into traction and that they were trying to inflate morale the way you inflate a cheap mattress, a lot of exhausting effort for something that would still sag in the middle by morning, and I kept my head down and did my job and answered the emails that mattered, the ones with contracts and timelines and deliverables, and let the family energy swirl around me like a storm that could not knock down a house it did not build. The cracks became hard to ignore even for my parents when a partner pulled out, then a developer left for a better offer, and by the time the launch week arrived the app had a landing page and a pitch and not much else, which did not stop my parents from smiling in every photo, and I might have felt sorry for them if I did not also have a folder of their words telling me that I was a poor investment. So when the event came and went with lots of handshakes and very few downloads, I received no call that night, only a text 2 days later with a chirpy update about early learnings and the importance of grit, and I answered with a thumbs up I did not send, because remembering my own rules matters. And instead, I replied with one sentence saying I hoped he was taking care of himself and that I was busy the next few weeks, which was true and also useful. The third revenge, which might not read as revenge until you have lived this dynamic long enough to recognize the shape of it, was a spreadsheet, and I built it slowly over several evenings when my focus was good. A simple log of every instance in which my parents used my name or my condition as conversational currency or justification in a group setting, each entry backed by a message or a witness. Because you cannot ask a system to correct itself if you do not show it where it fails, and I shared the sheet with exactly one person besides Lena, the programming lead at the community center who had invited me to the panel, and who also happened to manage speaker selection for a quarterly series on ethical leadership. And I did not ask for anything. I simply said that the pattern I was documenting was part of why I wanted to talk about boundaries and accountability, and she replied that my clarity was rare and that she would be in touch about a slot in the next cycle. I found out the money was gone not from my parents, not from Ethan, but from a neighbor who attends the same morning group my father likes to treat like a private salon. And she told me in the most neutral tone she could manage that there had been a frank discussion about rerouting resources and rethinking priorities, and that my mother had cried and said families have seasons, and then, because this is how the universe likes to write punchlines, an email landed in my inbox from the community center announcing the next quarter's speakers with my name listed for a talk on boundaries and care in professional and personal communities, and I read it twice, Not because I doubted it, but because sometimes the lock clicks so cleanly you want to hear it again. I did not call my parents to tell them. I did not bait them with an invitation. I did nothing at all except confirm with the organizer that the room would be open to members and guests. And then I sent one final notice that would look like logistics to anyone else and like a guillotine to the people who know me. A message to my parents saying that going forward all communication should be in writing and that I would not be attending family events this season due to scheduling conflicts and that if they needed emergency medical information they should contact Lena, who had full authority, and I know how that reads, cold or calculated or both. But when you have been told your reality is a stunt you learn that clean lines are not cruelty. They are safety. And as I hit send I understood that they would show up to that talk without an invitation because they always sit in the front row when there is applause nearby, and this time, finally, the applause would not be for them. It did not happen all at once. The shift from the casual updates about Ethan's early traction to the quieter, more deliberate calls and emails that seemed to arrive at strategic times of day, as if my parents were planning their approach in a way they had never done when I actually needed them. It began with a voicemail from my mother that was framed like a routine check-in but slipped, almost imperceptibly, into questions about how busy I was lately and whether I had been keeping in touch with certain relatives, the kind of questions that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with taking my temperature before making a pitch. And then came my father with a text saying he'd been thinking about how families go through difficult seasons and that this might be one of those times when we all needed to show up for each other. Which was almost funny given the years they had spent making it clear that showing up was optional if the person in need was me. I answered neither message right away, partly because I was busy and partly because I wanted them to feel that I was no longer on call, and when I finally did reply it was in measured, deliberate sentences that didn't leave much room for them to twist or reinterpret, but the tone of their responses told me everything I needed to know. The startup had failed in a way they could not spin. The $80,000 was gone. And the family's new priority was to patch over the cracks in their public image before anyone else noticed how large those cracks really were. My father suggested a family dinner to clear the air, and my mother floated the idea of a weekend together at the lake house they liked to rent for milestone events, and I knew instantly that neither of these invitations was about me. They were about controlling the story before it started circulating in ways they couldn't manage. In the past, I might have accepted one of those invitations just to avoid the inevitable round of phone calls to other relatives complaining about how I'd refused to meet them halfway, but this time was different. Because I had already decided that my forgiveness, if it came at all, would be on my terms and in my setting, not theirs. I wrote back politely, saying that my calendar was packed and I couldn't commit to anything in the near future, but that I hoped they would find a chance to relax and regroup after such a busy year. The absence of anger in my message was intentional. I wanted them to feel the distance without giving them a single sentence they could frame as evidence of bitterness, and judging from my mother's follow-up, where she asked point-blank if I was still upset about the funding decision, the tactic worked. What they did not know, what they could not have guessed from my polite deflections, was that by this point I had already accepted an invitation to speak at the community center's quarterly series, an event that drew many of their friends, peers, and professional contacts, and I had confirmed that my talk would take place during a slot they often attended. I had also quietly worked with the organizer to make sure my introduction would highlight the work I had done over the past year, framing my accomplishments in terms of resilience, resourcefulness, and building a life outside the framework of other people's validation, all of it true, none of it naming them directly. But every detail lined up so cleanly with our history that anyone who knew the context would connect the dots without me ever lifting a finger to point. The irony was that while they were inching closer with every message, trying to position themselves as the parents who stood by their daughter, they were walking right into a room where their own words and choices would be reflected back to them by people whose opinions they valued far more than mine. And they would have no way to stop it, because I wasn't breaking any rules, I wasn't making accusations, and I wasn't even speaking about them directly. I was telling my story in a way that anyone could relate to, which is exactly why it would land harder than any confrontation could. The weeks leading up to the talk became an exercise in patience, because every new message from them confirmed what I had suspected. They were desperate to reset the narrative without acknowledging what they had done. My father wrote an email about family legacy and wanting to make sure we stayed connected. My mother called one afternoon with a strangely soft voice, asking if I'd thought about the possibility of all of us working together on a community project. And while the offers sounded generous on the surface, they were just new versions of the same pattern, ways to look united in public without doing the work in private. I declined each suggestion with a calm, neutral tone that must have been maddening for them, because there was no foothold for an argument and no victory in getting me to meet on their terms. What they never understood, and what I did not bother explaining, was that my silence was not about punishing them in the way they imagined. It was about giving them exactly what they had given me for years: the absence of belief, the absence of support, the absence of effort when it mattered. They had shown me that my needs were negotiable, that their comfort mattered more than my reality, and now I was simply applying that same math in reverse. The difference was that my version of it came with boundaries instead of excuses, and the result would not be a private argument no one remembered, but a public moment no one in that room would forget. By the time the week of the event arrived, they had shifted from hints to outright statements about how much they missed me, how they wanted to move past misunderstandings, how they didn't want to lose me over something they claimed was never personal. But I was past the point where those words could work, because they were still skipping the one step that mattered: owning their choices. And without that, all the invitations, all the soft voices, and all the strategically timed messages were just background noise to the main event I had been quietly preparing for months. I didn't tell them I'd be speaking, and I didn't need to, because I knew them well enough to know they'd be there. They were the type who showed up for anything that might put them in the orbit of applause, and the community center's quarterly series was exactly the kind of gathering they considered a social obligation. Which meant that for once, they'd be seated in the audience with everyone else, waiting for a story, not realizing until halfway through that they were hearing their own reflected back at them, only this time stripped of the comfortable version they'd been telling themselves for years. And that was exactly how I wanted it. They arrived the way they always did when there might be applause, a few minutes early with the kind of practice small talk that lets them test the room, and I watched from the side as the chairs filled with neighbors and colleagues and the familiar faces from committee photos. And I understood that I did not need anger to make this work, because the room itself would do most of the heavy lifting. So when the organizer finished the introduction and handed me the mic, I took a breath that was not a performance breath, but a steadying one, and I began with something plain and impossible to argue with, which was that a person's story belongs to them. And that consent is not just a legal checkbox, but a line that keeps us honest about what we value when no one is grading us. I did not say their names. I did not describe their outfits or who they arrived with. I did not hint at details only family would know. Instead, I laid out a sequence of choices that anyone could map onto their own life. And I talked about what it feels like when you ask for help and are told to stop making drama, and I explained that there is a cost to being disbelieved that does not show up in a bill, but that collects interest anyway. And then, because this was the part that mattered, I described how a different decision was made when a shiny idea arrived at the table, how suddenly there were resources and meetings and optimism, and I did it in the same even voice I used in every meeting where I had to be twice as clear to be heard once. And then I put 3 sentences on a slide, not with names, not with dates, just the words themselves in a large, readable font, the same words my parents had sent me in email, that my updates were draining, that I should reframe my symptoms as challenges, that investing in something that could scale was wiser for the family right now, and I let the room read them in silence. You could feel the shift the way you feel someone stand up behind you, not as a dramatic gasp, but as a quiet recalibration, a sliding of puzzle pieces into place. And I stayed on the slide for a beat longer than was comfortable, because discomfort is where people actually see themselves, and then I moved on to what I had done next, not as a self-help arc but as a practical blueprint. How I documented everything so I would not be trapped in he said, she said, how I changed my proxy and boundaries so I would not be used as a prop when it was convenient, How I stopped trying to win the unwinnable argument and instead picked an audience that valued evidence over familiarity, and when I talked about the difference between public unity and private care. A woman in the third row nodded so hard I thought her necklace would snap, and that was when I knew the landing would hold. During the questions, I kept it just as clean. I said that families are complicated and love without accountability is just sentiment. I said that forgiveness is not an event with a ribbon cutting, it is a system with rules. I said that people tell on themselves when attention is near, and when someone asked whether there was any path back, I told the truth that I did not know because I had never been offered repair without conditions, and because I was done paying admission to rooms where my health had to perform for the right to be believed, and I could feel the front row, where my parents sat with smiles that had slipped, waiting for me to soften it, and I did not. If you want the revenge, here it is, and it is boring and devastating at the same time. The talk was recorded, as all the talks in that series are. And within 2 days the center posted the video to its members page with a short write-up that emphasized consent and boundaries, and the quotes on the slide were now frozen in a place my parents considered their stage. Preserved without names yet unmistakable to anyone who had sat through their fundraising speeches and heard the same phrases. Delivered with pride, and within a week I heard that 3 different people had asked my mother whether she knew the speaker, and she had to choose between lying badly or telling the truth that she recognized every word. And either option cost her the one currency she cares about, the assumption that she is the generous woman in every story. My father emailed first, a long message about miscommunication and unintended hurt and family legacy, and I replied with one paragraph that said I had nothing to add beyond what I had said on stage. That going forward I would only respond to written requests that were specific and time-bound, and that emergency contacts had been updated months ago. Then I set an auto-response that funneled any message from them or from the family chat into a folder labeled for legal, because order is not cruelty. It is oxygen, and then I blocked their numbers so that if they wanted to speak, they would have to write, and if they wanted to write, they would have to do it knowing there would be a record. And in that simple sequence, the years of power they held evaporated like spilled soda on a hot sidewalk, sticky and gone. Ethan tried calling from a different number, and I let it ring out because I do not owe him the role of translator, and he sent a text that said he had not understood how much it all hurt and that he wished he had done more, and I saved it without replying. Not as a trophy, but as proof that clarity eventually penetrates even the thickest fog when the lights are bright enough. And later I heard that my parents were telling people there had been a misunderstanding and that they were devastated I had cut off the people who raised me, and I did not correct the phrasing because, for once, it was accurate. I had cut them off. I had done it cleanly and publicly and without spectacle. And I had given them a reason that did not require a single adjective to make its case. I kept one last courtesy for the end because endings matter, a short message sent to both of them after the video went live, not angry, not performative, just a final instruction and a boundary. And I wrote that if they wanted to understand why they no longer had access to me, they should watch the first 20 minutes of my talk and then reread their own emails, and if they needed more than that, there was nothing more to say. And then I turned off my laptop and went for a walk that was not symbolic or cinematic. It was just me moving my body because it felt good to move without bracing for impact. They are still in my inbox sometimes, not in real time but as filtered notifications that I review like a cautious auditor, and every few weeks there is a new subject line with the familiar tone of people who want absolution without confession. And I do not take the bait, because the plan is finished and the last move has already landed, and the truth is that I do not need them to admit anything for the win to be real. I only needed them to be seen, and they were, by the exact people whose approval they built their lives around, which means the scoreboard that has always mattered to them no longer reads the way it used to, and whether they ever say the words out loud is irrelevant, because the record exists, the boundary holds, and the story finally belongs to me.